spring of 1883 came to Willow Creek the way a careful hand smooths a quilt. Slow, sure, leaving warm patches where sun found the ground. The air smelled of wet earth and the small, bright insistence of things beginning. Grass remembered its green. Cottonwoods tested their buds like questions. The wind hadn't turned warm, not yet, but it carried a softness that made even the worn track of the Great Northern Railway feel briefly hopeful. When the locomotive hissed to a halt and uncurled a ghost of steam, travelers stepped down in their tidy sequence. Ranch hands with bedrolls, a mother with a fretful baby, a salesman guarding a valise as if it contained a king's ransom rather than combs and tonic. Last came a woman in a pale blue coat with her hat pinned steadfast against the breeze. She carried a white box tied with ivory ribbon and balanced it atop a modest carpet-bag. Her name was Eliza May Wilson, and the box held a wedding dress she had sewn herself by lantern light, each stitch a small promise to an imagined future. Eliza was 32, an age that knew how to carry itself through rooms where it was not expected. She had the kind of beauty that lived in steadiness, blue glass eyes that did not flinch, shoulders that had learned to square without hardening, a mouth unafraid of silence. Back east, she had kept earned bread on her table by hemming and letting out the clothes of women who bore children and weather and work. She knew fabric the way a good reader knows scripture, by feel and breath and what it chose to reveal. She stepped onto the platform, scanning faces for one in particular. Thomas Hall had written her a year of letters, kissed with borrowed poetry and freighted with plans. A small homestead under the ridge, a minister amicable to short notice, a life woven of two threads if only she would come. He had mailed a photograph with his jaw set handsome and the corners of his mouth trying for tender. He had written sunrise like a man who believed it waited on him. No one stood at the end of the platform with their hat in hand. No one lifted a palm and called her name. A boy from the telegraph office came running, dusty to the knees and earnest, holding out a folded slip as if it burned to touch. "Ms. Wilson?" he asked, already knowing. She nodded. Her hands, calloused by needlework and the work before that, opened the paper with the precision of someone who had learned that tearing is a thing you can avoid if you go slow enough. "Eliza, I'm sorry. I thought I could, but I can't. Please don't look for me. Thomas." Ink didn't tremble, but something in her chest did. She read the 7 words that mattered twice. I thought I could. I can't. She knew, with the clarity that falls after a hard rain, what the telegram did not name. The way a black woman's face and a full body had rattled a man who wanted his life to fit in someone else's picture frame. She had seen it between the lines in his late letters, the sudden careful talk of how people are, of easing into things, of you know how folks can be. Folks meant family. Family meant a measuring stick held to her skin and her hips and her future and found wanting by people who hadn't earned the right to weigh her. The platform did not blink. The porter shouted something about luggage. The salesman tipped his hat at the mother with the baby. The world continued, as if her life had slid on its rails and found empty air. Eliza lifted the white box tighter against her middle and walked off the platform into town. She passed buildings with paint peeling like old paper. She passed a pair of boys throwing stones at a bottle until it surrendered. She passed a woman who let her gaze skim Eliza's face, then skim lower, then away, fast, as if morality had a speed. Eliza's steps took her to the far edge of town, where the whitewashed chapel kept its shoulders squared to the weather. She sat on the stone steps and set the box beside her, like a reliquary for a saint no one had canonized. She did not cry. She counted the beats of her heart as if they might settle into a pattern she recognized. Sometimes sorrow presented itself like a loud visitor. Sometimes it sat beside you and said nothing at all. This one was the quieter kind. People passed. Some looked and then looked again, that second glance full of the arithmetic they could never admit out loud. Black and fat, too much of both, not enough of something else they could not name without sinning. But the town's cruelty was an old hymn hummed soft. It pretended to be concern. Thomas had not invented it. He had only chosen it over her. Late afternoon folded its light in gentle halves. That was when Frank Davis came up the road with his boy, Jacob, from the smithy. Frank was broad, the way a barn is broad, built to hold weather and tools and other people's temporary burdens. His shirt was dark with honest sweat, belt notched where life had asked for more room. Beside him, Jacob chattered about nails and frogs and the important distinction between the two. Frank saw Eliza as a tall figure in a pale coat with a white box at her side and a stillness that made him slow. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, you all right?" Eliza lifted her gaze. The blue of her eyes was the water at the bottom of a well, clear, deep, waiting. She said, "I will be," and the future tense was a choice. The telegram lay folded in her glove. Jacob leaned, all 5 years of truth. "Is it a cake?" he asked, pointing at the box. Eliza's mouth softened. She said, "A dress." "Yours?" he asked. She nodded. "You getting married?" Her throat worked. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Frank didn't ask anything more. His grief, once raw from a wife buried with a child who hadn't lived to be named, had taught him the manners of silence. He said, "We live just a ridge over. Ain't much, but there's a warm stove and some stew that won't keep till morning if I don't get help with it. You're welcome to rest." He had not said, "What happened?" He had said, "You're welcome." Eliza looked at the chapel door as if it might open for her in a different way. Then she looked at the man and at the boy, at the faint dust on their boots, and at the way the boy's hand had found his father's fingers without looking. She stood, lifted the white box, and nodded once. Consent could be quiet and still count. Frank carried the box as if it contained something fragile and alive. He helped her onto the wagon seat, Jacob climbing up between them with a solemnity that lasted almost 5 seconds before he resumed talking about frogs. The reins clicked, the wheels found ruts, and the cottonwoods on the far side of town leaned their branches together as the 3 of them passed beneath. Behind them, the platform went on dispatching arrivals and departures. Ahead of them, a crooked porch waited, a lantern by the door that flickered when the wind decided it could. Eliza sat with her back straight and her hands settled on the white ribbon in her lap. The dress inside it was a history she had sewn with hope. The woman holding it was learning how to be her own future. She watched the road unfold and let herself think one simple thing she had not permitted all day. There is nothing wrong with me to fix. There is only a life to live.
Frank's place crouched just beyond the town line, a square-shouldered house under 2 cottonwoods that had not yet remembered how to leaf. The path up to the porch was a handwriting of wagon ruts and thawed mud, and the porch itself leaned a polite inch toward visitors, as if to say it had learned to meet people part way. He pushed open the door with a palm broad as a bread peel and stepped aside so Eliza could enter first, the white box cradled in his arms like something that might startle if jostled. Inside smelt of sawdust and cinnamon and the good fatigue of useful days. Tools stood stacked near the hearth, a cedar shaving curled on the floor like a question mark. On the table, Half-carved birdhouses waited with their mouths open for song. A Bible lay open on the mantel where a ribbon marked the Psalms, and the sprig of last year's lavender kept the page from arguing. The room did not apologize for itself. It offered what it had. "Ain't much," Frank said, setting the box carefully by the coat pegs, "but it's home." He spoke the word home with a quiet that made it bigger. Eliza paused just past the threshold, the way a person does who has learned to be a careful guest in a world that doesn't always offer chairs. Her gaze touched the details and kept them: the mended curtain string, the patched rug, the cup on the sill turned upside down to keep out dust. Her pale blue coat breathed a little easier in the warm room. She let her bonnet ribbon slip loose, but kept the bonnet itself in her hand, a traveler's reflex that time would soften. "Sit if you like," Frank added, already moving toward the stove. "I'll warm supper." "You don't have to." It came out of her as habit, not instruction. "I'm good at it," Jacob declared from the doorway where he had stopped to pry at a stubborn bootlace. "Ma taught me." The word hung in the room with the same respected space as Scripture. Frank's jaw worked once, not with grief's sting anymore, but with the memory of how to hold it gently so it wouldn't bruise others. They ate with the kind of ease that doesn't need introduction: stew that tasted like patience, cornbread that remembered a heavy hand with butter. Frank portioned without commentary and refilled her water before she noticed the glass was low. Jacob shouldered the conversation with the importance of 5 years, telling about a goose at school that chased Mr. Bell into a barrel and how nails could sing if you tapped them right. Eliza listened and found the tight places behind her ribs loosen by half. It was not that anyone tried to cheer her, it was that no one required her to explain herself. When Jacob's eyes began to close between bites, Eliza rose on instinct. "Would you mind if I—" Frank jerked his chin toward the small side room. "He sleeps best if someone tucks in the quilt tight." The boy's room wore the echo of a softer blue and the quick, bright touch of a mother's hands long before. Tin stars dotted the ceiling, cut from scraps Frank had saved because waste offended him. Eliza tucked the quilt around Jacob's shoulders, smoothing the fabric like a benediction. "You'll be here tomorrow, right?" he mumbled, already halfway to sleep. "I don't know," she whispered, and surprised herself with the honesty and the want inside it. Back in the sitting room, Frank handed her a folded blanket and motioned toward a cushioned bench near the hearth. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's asking for anything." The permission in those words set down roots she could feel. That night the fire threw patient shapes on the wall while Frank sat at the table and whittled a small bird from soft pine. His size did not make his hands clumsy. He was a large man in the way the cottonwoods were large, their generosity measured in shade. His shirt strained at the middle and he didn't make war on it. The leather belt showed an extra notch he had added himself, practical as any fence repair. He fit his life as he was, and it fit him back. Eliza, who had spent years trying to occupy less air so men might not call her too much, too black, too full, too present, watched the way his body took its rightful space and felt something inside her sit up straighter. Morning rose early and found them at simple tasks that turned into a rhythm with no meeting about it. He carried in wood, she measured coffee. Jacob fetched kindling and opinions. After breakfast, Eliza's feet wandered to the backyard where a rectangle of soil lay gray and pocked, a garden bed that had once fed someone and then didn't. No one asked her to fix it. She knelt anyway. Pulling weeds is a kind of prayer. It says this ground can give again if we tend it. She found a pamphlet tucked on a shelf, Miss Tansey's Guide to Practical Kitchen Gardens, its pages smudged by someone's old hope. She read while the kettle sighed, mouth tilting into a smile at the bossy margins and inked-in conversions. By noon she had staked curved rows for chamomile, tomatoes, carrots, and radishes. By evening, soil threaded her cuticles, her back ached honest, and Jacob could pronounce lupine like a spell that opened doors. "You don't have to do all that," Frank said from the porch, leaning against the post. He had been repairing a hinge, and the hinge had learned to behave. "I know," she answered without looking up. "That's why it helps." He watched her a while without turning his care into surveillance. The plus-size cowboy and the plus-size seamstress moved around each other with the care of people who had been made to believe they were too much, and who had decided, separately and then together, to be exactly what they were. He held the door wide when she came through with a basket. She did not apologize for filling the doorway. Cora Poper arrived 2 days later with pickled eggs, a loaf of bread, and a brow already arched. "You're glowing," she observed, then added in a different register, "Small towns don't let people change without asking permission, honey. Some folks noticed you staying here." Eliza set the jar on the table and kept her voice even. "They can notice. I'm minding my work." Cora's gaze softened at the edges. "Then keep your chin up and be ready if he comes back." That night, Eliza sat at the table with a pencil and sketchbook. She did not draw satin-coated dreams anymore. She drew women like herself and her customers, hips that knew stairs, hands that knew laundry lines, backs that knew children and water buckets. She sketched sleeves that rolled, bodices that allowed breath, skirts that let a woman climb a wagon seat without ceremony. She drew pockets deep enough to carry a woman's day. Frank carved his bird and didn't ask to see. The quiet between them filled like a cistern after rain. Days stitched themselves into a small, steady life. She rose before the sun and brewed coffee dark enough to stand a spoon. He handed her the mug each morning on the porch swing, fingers sometimes brushing in a way neither of them called an accident. She hung laundry and didn't flinch at the sight of her own dresses on the line, the strong work of her seams visible in the bright air. He repaired a rail and measured twice, the habit of a man who had learned the cost of haste. Jacob asked if turtles could whistle and declared he would teach them if they could not. In the evenings, when the field turned the color of baked bread and the crickets tuned up, Eliza felt the house settle around them. Porch, swing, tin stars, Bible, birdhouses, as if the rooms themselves had been waiting for a full voice to answer back. She had arrived carrying a white box tied in ivory ribbon. Now her hands carried earth and thread and the weightless relief of not having to defend her shape to anyone under this roof.
My midsummer, the light stretched long as thread, and the garden gave back what careful hands had asked of it. Chamomile nodded in a pale yellow drift along the fence. Tomatoes showed off their shine. Carrots hid their sweetness under clean rows of dirt. The house breathed with a rhythm that no one announced. Coffee poured, hinge oiled, rail sanded, bread cooled, and Eliza moved through it with the calm of someone who had been told all her life to shrink and had, at last, decided against it. 2 afternoons a week, she climbed the narrow stairs above the general store and opened the door to her seamstress room. Women came with bodices that bit and sleeves that pinched, with waists that had grown honest from children and work. Eliza measured without apology. "Real bodies tell the truth," she said, chalk ticking like a metronome against cloth. "Let the dress be the one to change." On a Wednesday bright as a tin pail, Jacob had gone to a birthday picnic, and Frank was in the yard, sawing a new corral rail until it felt like a handshake. Eliza dusted flour from her forearms. She had set an apple pie on the sill to cool, and turned toward the white box by the pegs. It had stood in its corner all spring and most of summer, a silent guest no one pressed for conversation. She approached it now with the steady mercy you bring to an old hurt. The ribbon untied under her fingers with a sigh of habit, the lid lifted, and there it lay. Ivory silk, smooth as kept promises, lace sleeves folded like pretty cages. Lantern-lit nights and thread-count prayers were sewn into every seam. She held the dress to her chest, and for the first time since the telegram, slipped it over her head. The mirror offered back a woman in a story she no longer believed. The bodice clung where life had insisted she be more. The sleeves scratched. The waist demanded tribute for every breath. She turned once, and the skirt whispered the falsehood it had been made to whisper. Smaller is better. Less is love. She did not weep. She did not apologize to the empty room. She lifted the dress off, folded it over the cushioned bench, and drew her sewing table closer to the window. Her sketchbook lay open to a drawing she had made on a night when the garden soil still lived under her nails, a dress with freedom in its lines, pockets deep enough to carry a day. She set out scissors, needles, strong thread, and her breath. Then began. She cut the bodice from the skirt as cleanly as a woman separates what happened to her from who she is. She softened the neckline into a gentle V that honored her throat's rise and fall. She freed her arms from lace that had always behaved like a net. From linen she had dyed in chamomile, she drafted new sleeves that would roll without complaint and cool the skin at the bend of her elbow. The sash she cut wide and steady, not to cinch, but to hold, an embrace stitched into cloth. She unpicked tiny darts placed by a former self eager to disappear, and replaced them with seams that guided fabric toward comfort instead of correction. Needle in, needle out. The rhythm became a hymn she recognized from long ago, when faith had sounded like promise rather than bargain. Light shifted across the floor in dappled petals, lace shadows briefly blooming and then moving on. Outside, the saw sang its low, patient note as Frank worked the rail smooth. Inside, each stitch said the same quiet thing. Make room, make room, make room. When she finished the last long seam, she stood and let the dress settle over her. This time, the mirror answered with recognition. The fabric draped instead of clung, the waist wrapped instead of scolded. The sleeves invited reach and work and rest. She raised her arms, bent at the waist, sat, stood. Every movement returned the same reply. I fit you because I was made to. She reached into her basket and found the small felt pouch Jacob had knotted with twine. He had given it to her weeks earlier, so the dress box won't feel lonely, and she had tucked it away like a blessing awaiting its altar. With the tiniest, nearly invisible stitches, she placed the pouch inside the hem where her hand could find it with every step. A private promise, a boy's offering, a pocket for a folded note, or a button, or a prayer.
September crept in with a cooler edge, laying its quiet hand over the ranch and turning the cottonwoods a whisper paler each morning. Crickets tuned themselves at dusk, and the air, relieved of summer's heavy breath, tasted faintly of apples and sun-warmed boards. Eliza's seamstress room above the general store had settled into a steady hum. Women climbing the narrow stairs with bundles and sighs, leaving with garments that did not punish them for the lives they were living. Let the dress tell the truth, she would say, chalk-marking arcs that made space. Your body already does. That afternoon, the house held its usual comforts, like a hymn you know by heart. An apple pie steamed on the sill, the cinnamon lifting sweet and confident into the room. Jacob sprawled at the table, tongue tucked in the corner of his mouth, as he drew a turtle in a baker's hat opening a shop at the edge of a pond. Outside, Frank sanded the new corral rail to satin, his strokes slow and patient, the sound of someone who believed finish mattered. The knock came loud,
wrong to the rhythm of the place. Not Cora's breezy barrel-through, not a neighbor's polite rattle of knuckles. It was a knock that knew it didn't belong and dared the door to say so. Eliza wiped flour from her palms, slid a look to Jacob, safe, absorbed, and opened the door. Thomas Hall stood on the porch with his hat gripped in both hands, boots polished to a mirror shine that did the prairie no favors. His hair lay combed with the effort of a man trying to appear in order, and his mouth held a practiced sorrow that had convinced other doors in other towns. "Eliza May Wilson," he said, like a summons. He took in the swing, the tin stars on the porch beam, the boots by the threshold that did not match in size but did match in purpose. "Mr. Hall," she answered. Her voice was calm water. "You found the place." "I heard you were still in Willow Creek," he began, eyes skidding over the warm disorder. A cooling pie, a boy's hat hung cocked on a chair, a square of quilt left mid-mend. "I came to explain. I wasn't ready then. I didn't know how to say it. Things were complicated. My family, the talk." He faltered, then tried again with a smaller voice. "I made a mistake." She let the words sit where they landed. Behind her, Jacob giggled at something private on paper. Through the open window, the grain of Frank's sanding carried steady and low. Eliza stepped onto the porch and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. She didn't slam it. She didn't offer the inside. The line was drawn with the care of a chalk mark before cutting cloth. "You sent a telegram," she said. "It said you couldn't." He swallowed, cotton-mouthed. "I panicked," he offered. "A man can panic. Folks said things. You know how people are." "I do," she said, and the acknowledgment turned like a key that refused the wrong lock. His gaze caught on her dress, the chamomile-dyed sleeves, the wide sash that embraced without strangling, the way the fabric moved easily when she breathed. He had a picture in his head of what she should look like to make him brave. A small, paler woman who took less air and made his family quieter. This reality unset him. "You look different," he said, and meant, "You look like you stopped asking permission." "I am different," she answered. "I stopped treating myself like your compromise." He tried a smile. "Maybe we could start over. I've had time to think. I regret what I lost." Eliza's head tilted, a seamstress assessing a poor cut. "You never knew what you had," she said, the words shaped without heat, only clarity. "You wrote me a year of sunrises and plans, and then you saw me, my skin, my size, and you heard your people louder than you heard me. You chose their measure over my humanity. That's not panic, that's preference." A muscle ticked in his jaw. He searched for ground that would hold him. "Folks talk," he tried again, the old refuge of the small-hearted. "They do," she agreed, not rescuing him from his own sentence. "And you let them do your choosing." Silence laid itself between them, a clean plank. He shifted his hat, then offered the last coin in his pocket. "I'm sorry." The words were real and not enough, both. "I accept that," she said. "We don't need a sequel." He blinked, surprised at the structure of an ending he did not author. "You won't even consider?" "I've considered," she said, not unkind. "I considered on a train platform and on a chapel step. I considered while planting chamomile and cutting a dress that could breathe. I considered while a boy handed me a felt pouch so the dress box wouldn't feel lonely. I made my decision in a life I built here." He tipped his head toward the door, left a careful inch ajar. where a child's voice and the scent of apple and the low rasp of a file braided into something like belonging. He followed her glance and for a second saw the shape of the thing he had misnamed. Not spectacle, not rescue, home. "Take care, Eliza," he said at last, and though part of him hoped the words might yet behave like a key, he turned without waiting to see. "I am," she said, and her voice made it true. "I truly am." He mounted, tugged the brim of his hat, and set his horse toward town. Dust lifted, considered settling on the porch rail, then thought better of it and went to ground where it belonged. Eliza stood a moment in the softened light, listening to the house continue its life without asking whether a man on the road approved. She opened the door with the same gentle hand she used on fragile seams. Jacob looked up from his drawing. Who was it? "Someone who was lost," she said, and crossed the room. She did not hurry. She pressed her palm to the inside hem of her dress, and felt the small square weight of Jacob's felt pouch, tapping against her shin. A boy's offering, a secret pocket for courage, a reminder stitched where her hand could find it. The house exhaled. Outside, the cottonwoods spoke their leaf language to the oncoming dark. Inside, a woman stood at her own threshold and knew exactly which doors to open and which to leave almost closed. Jacob looked up from his drawing. Who was it? Who was it? "Someone who was lost," she said, and crossed the room. She did not hurry. She pressed her palm to the inside hem of her dress, and felt the small square weight of Jacob's felt pouch, tapping against her shin. A boy's offering, a secret pocket for courage, a reminder stitched where her hand could find it. Frank stepped into the kitchen a few minutes later, dust on his boots, the evening at his shoulders. He took in the air with a craftsman's senses. What had changed? What remained? He didn't ask. He set a glass of water on the table, so the cold could mark a ring on the wood, and nodded toward the pie. "Smells right," he said. "It does," she answered, sitting. The water tempered something warm behind her ribs. Jacob turned his drawing so they could both see. The turtle had opened a bakery. There was a line at the door. "This one's you," he told Eliza, tapping the turtle's hat, "'cause you carry important things and don't drop 'em when folks get loud." Eliza laughed, the sound full in the small room. "That's a fine turtle," she said. Later, when Jacob slept and Frank closed up the yard, Eliza sat at the table with her sketchbook. She wrote one sentence under a quick pencil sketch of a porch with a door that was mostly shut. "I will not barter my dignity for belonging." She closed the book, slid it beneath the sewing box, and laid her palm against her hem again, feeling the soft tap. Seen, chosen, loved. The house exhaled. Outside, the cottonwoods spoke their leaf language to the oncoming dark. Inside, a woman stood at her own threshold and knew exactly which doors to open and which to leave almost closed.
A week after the road took Thomas's dust and kept it, morning came and clean and gold. The house wore its usual scents, coffee rising, boards warming, a faint trace of chamomile from the sleeves Eliza had dyed, and the day arranged itself with the quiet purpose they had learned together. Frank came in from the yard with dirt softening his boots and something wrapped in burlap held careful in his hands. He did not clear his throat for courage or hunt for speeches in the corners. He set the bundle on the table between a cooling pan of cornbread and Eliza's pincushion, and looked at her the way a man looks at work he hopes to keep doing for the rest of his life. "I'd be honored to walk this life with you, side by side," he said. The room did not tilt, though Eliza felt the floor accept a new weight. She studied him as if taking a final measure, big-shouldered, middle generous, shirt tugged a little at the buttons, and utterly unconcerned about it. Hands nicked by tools and made for gentleness anyway. Eyes the color of creek water where trees lean in. She saw the man who had offered a stove and stew without asking questions, who refilled water before it was empty, who gave silence like a blanket. She saw the boy behind him in the yard, crouched over an anthill, narrating industry. She saw the garden through the window, where chamomile brightened the fence. She set down her needle. He unwrapped the burlap. Inside lay a small wooden box, rough but lovingly carved, the lid inlaid with a single tin star, kin to the ones that kept vigil on Jacob's ceiling. He opened it to reveal a simple silver band, the inside edge etched with 2 pairs of initials, EMW and FD, close enough to touch. Eliza did not search for poetry. She had lived enough of other people's words. She said, yes, and found that the single syllable filled the room exactly right. No echo, no wobble. Frank exhaled like a man who has been bracing for a storm and finds the sky fair. He picked up the ring and slid it gently over her finger. Then he kept her hands in his, warmth meeting warmth, and added the words he'd brought in his pocket. I don't spend time on people's talk. They'll say too black and too big and too much, like they're measuring flour for a loaf they never planned to eat. I don't reckon with any of that. He held her gaze so there could be no misunderstanding. You're all I want. It was plain speech, the kind he used with fence posts and horses and God. It did not need sweetening. It needed only to be true. Cora learned of the decision within the hour. She had a smell for news, and bustled in as if the kitchen had sent for her. She kissed Eliza's cheek, thumped Frank on the shoulder like a congratulatory hammer, and set about planning a wedding at a pace that would wind a younger woman. She said, under the cottonwood, where the ground degrees with lows, I'll see to the cake, you two see to the rest, and Jacob can carry the rings unless he eats them, in which case I will tan his hide with a wooden spoon. Jacob promised to abstain from ring consumption and practiced his serious face until it made him giggle. They chose a week's wait because Harvest did not consult engagements. In that stretch of days, small things clicked into their places. Frank pressed his best shirt. Eliza finished a new dress of soft ivory linen, sleeves dyed in chamomile, sash wide and forgiving. She lined the hem with even tinier stitches and checked the felt pouch nested there, the way some women check a locket, touching for assurance rather than fear. Above the general store, customers heard the news in a hush or a cheer, depending on their hearts. About time, one said with satisfaction, as Eliza let out a waistband and the woman breathed easier for it. Where would loves you back, Eliza replied, and she was clearly speaking of more than cloth. The day arrived clear as rinsed glass. Neighbors came carrying chairs and casseroles and opinions they were wise enough to keep to themselves. The cottonwood kept its long shade, the swing nudged the breeze, and the garden wore its honest greens like witness. Jacob wore a buttoned shirt too big across the shoulders and held a small tin star box with both hands, walking as if the ground would be offended by any bouncing. Frank took his place under the tree. With the patience of a man who knows nothing precious is improved by haste. Eliza stepped from the house as the light gentled sideways. Her dress moved with her, no pinch, no lie. The felt pouch at the hem brushed her leg in its small rhythm. She saw the faces that mattered, Cora shining like a domestic archangel,
Jacob earnest and vibrating, Frank steady and wide as the horizon. And then she saw only Frank. His eyes did not count or compare. They welcomed. The preacher was local, a man who understood that vows are less about flourish than about keeping. He spoke briefly. When it was time to answer, Eliza felt the words rise, shaped by the months behind her. She said, "With all I am, not because I was broken, but because I was found." Frank's reply landed with the same rightness as a well-set beam. He said, "With all I have, not to save you, but to walk beside you." Jacob, as ring-bearer, fulfilled his office with a gravity that would have shamed a judge. Frank slid the band over Eliza's finger. Eliza pressed a chamomile ribbon into Frank's palm, a loop for memory. When it was time to seal it, he leaned in and kissed her, the way he fixed a hinge and handed over a coffee cup. Sure, careful, meant to last. Not spectacle. Agreement. The gathered voices rose, and Jacob whooped, startled at his own sound, and then did it again on purpose. They ate cake on quilt-draped chairs, while the light softened into honey, and the cottonwood flickered its leaves like applause. Cora, pretending not to wipe her eyes, declared the crumb acceptable and the frosting near perfect. A neighbor fiddled a tune that made old feet remember and young ones test their pride. Frank and Eliza moved among their people, receiving blessing in the form of handshakes, embraces, and a basket of eggs pressed on them with instructions for future breakfast. Later, when the noise thinned and the stars came pricking through, Eliza and Frank stood at the fence line. The corral rail he had sanded sat smooth under their palms. The ring warmed to her skin. The dress held her like a sentence completed. The pouch at her hem tapped its little reminder, room. She looked at the man beside her, at the house that smelled of sawdust and cinnamon, at the garden rose learning generosity, at the swing that had carried so many small talks at dawn. She understood that she had not been rescued from solitude by a hero. She had met a companion and chosen a life. He threaded his fingers through hers, palm broad and certain. He did not repeat himself. He didn't need to. She heard it anyway in the hush between cricket notes, in the timbre of his breath, in the way he stood bearing the full weight of his own body without apology. "You're all I want." She believed him because his life agreed with his words, and because, at last, hers did too.